ClimateTech has this challenge, and probably ClimateTech as a term will disappear in the future. As a term, too much focused on the green part of it.
It's really hard to commercialize. Who are usually the payers? Green is not sufficient to be backable. What's your diet like after investing into so many alternative protein products?
My personal diet is
Christian, so nice to be here at your office.
Thank you so much for coming by. I mean, for me it was pretty easy. We were doing it in our offices here, but you took a long way to get here. So
I'm super excited to really building authentic connections here in your office, like in Berlin this time. Great to be introduced by Han. So actually, how did you two meet?
We met in 2021 when we were looking into a startup jointly, considering doing an investment. In the end, Han ended up doing the investment.
And you didn't?
And Foodlabs didn't, because we had one other portfolio company which wasn't directly conflicting, but could have been a conflict because they could have expanded into that vertical. It was in the grocery delivery space. It's called YUVC now. It used to be called Alofin, French-based company, but for Asian food and restaurant delivery. But the investment that Han made was probably wiser.
Okay, but maybe in the future, like you might have fewer overlaps because like he's oil consumer, but now you are like having a more focus on ClimateTech.
Yeah,
ClimateTech is less consumer facing directly.
Did you visit him in Austin? He's based in Austin.
No, we actually last time he was visiting Shanghai. And Shanghai was actually like 2 hours of drive from our base. So we actually recorded the podcast while having a lunch. Ended up very well in a serendipity.
Okay.
Yeah, actually. So we're going to start with your upbringings and your early signs of being an investor or founder. And then second, we'll also discuss like why venture capital is a thing to you, or why do you choose the path of venture capital. And then we're going to dive in like your wildest tech dreams and or, like your broader views on the Berlin ecosystem and European venture scenes. So I'm quite excited about all of these stuff. Could you, in a few sentences, describe yourself a bit?
Yeah, sounds great. I'm from the countryside of Germany. I grew up in Lower Saxony near Hanover. Brought up in a really cozy, down-to-earth environment in the 90s. And I think really when it comes to ambitions and also venture capital, I had zero connections with it. The most ambitious thing that people where I grew up with were dreaming about was maybe working for Volkswagen. So we have this Mittelstand in Germany, like really solid middle class. And then I did my Abitur.
It was like high school, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's like high school. It allows you to study at German universities.
Yeah.
And I was somehow ambitious, but also didn't have a clue. And there's always this joke in Germany: if you don't know what you're going to do, then you're going to study business administration. I started working at a student consultancy that seemed like an interesting industry to work in, because you get to work with different clients. And then after my bachelor studies, I thought I had like a great job in consulting, but pretty much learned that it was not what I was dreaming about, and it was very technical partially. So it was about implementing new software, replacing SAP, and working with a bit more old school German corporates. Yeah. And at the same time, during my way to work, where I was a bit frustrated, I started listening to podcasts actually. That was in 2016. And so really listening to podcasts back then.
That was quite early. I guess like the second year, Harry Stebbing started his own podcast.
Yeah. And actually in Germany, the podcast I started listening to was the OMR podcast. It was more around marketing back then, but also touched upon some entrepreneurial stories. So I decided I need to do something different. Consulting wasn't for me, so I just took the master's studies basically to do a ton of internships. So I worked in sales and product management, big tech, so seen many different industries. And just at the end, when I thought, okay, I have already some clue now what I'm gonna do next, I had some more time left for one internship, and which was with Project A. And it wasn't so much that I wanted to go into venture capital. but that I just found Project A as a company quite interesting. And then which is where I really fell in love with venture capital, and then started working on it.
I mean, they describe themselves as like the operational VC. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And this is also how, so they were doing some presentation at my master's university, and I figured it's a cool company because they have this operational approach. Should I maybe work with the operational team? But then I thought, well, in the end, if it's a VC firm, maybe I should work with the investment team. So almost by accident, I started working with them. And this was then my entry point to venture capital.
Cool.
So that's a long way in the making from Lower Saxony to then I think I was then 28, 29 back then when I then started working with VC.
I also noticed that during your master's studies, you exchanged to Taipei. You studied at the National Taiwan University. And what kind of experience was that to you? And what made you to exchange to Taipei?
It was a very meaningful experience, and also one of the reasons why I wanted to do a master's. From the countryside, and at that moment I haven't seen so much from the world yet, except maybe for 1 or 2 vacations. But when you're on vacation, it doesn't really teach you anything about a different culture or country maybe. So for me it was really important to doing something that's really different from Europe. So I didn't want to go to some other place in Europe. I didn't want to go to Northern America because it seemed too close. And I also wanted to go to some places where I felt like they're quite advanced. So that's why I was thinking about Eastern Asia back then. So I was thinking about China, Japan, Korea, and then ended up going to Taipei because it was quite affordable, actually. The university has a good reputation, and some friends were also going there. So I decided to go to Taipei. Was there for 5 months, and it was just a cool experience, not being somewhere completely different where nobody knows you. And
did you travel there a bit? And what's like the biggest takeaway for you from there?
I think there were many subtle differences. I forgot the name of the course, but it was pretty much about doing business in China. And I remember they taught us some terms around guanxi was one term, and I think the other term was mianzi, something like that. Mianzi.
What's that?
You write it M-I-A-N-Z-I. It's pretty much about the concept of saving face, and it was just
your ego.
Very interesting because German culture is just very direct and straightforward, which has its advantages and disadvantages depending on your personality type.
It's quite interesting that you put this man's thing up. Well, take myself for an instance. I worked here, study here, and always lowering your own egos is always beneficial.
I've done it the other way around, right?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So Project A was your early experience into VC, and so did you have any figure in your mind, who guided you into the VC?
I've worked with quite a few funds actually by now. Project A was an internship, and then I've worked with 3 different funds. I started my career as an analyst at btov Venture. Then I worked 4 years with Foodlabs, and now I've joined Extantia. But still, I would say the investor I've learned the most from, also I guess operationally, it was the time at Project A, because the learning curve is just so steep at the beginning.
Especially with the first experience.
Especially with the first experience. And one person there who was back then just an investment manager was Andy, who's now a partner at Atomico. And I mean, to me, it's no surprise that he's done quite well, having seen him back then. And I think things I learned from him, but also from the team in general at Project A back then, was just, I think, a certain mindset of being founder-friendly. Being founder-friendly is almost like a platitude, but he did a good job embodying what that meant, and I really took that as guiding principle. And the other stuff was more operationally. Just in the end, I think venture capital is about having good processes and really thinking about how you as a firm wanna act and what's your edge. But also, again, always thinking in processes. Venture capital is also an art to some degree, especially the more earlier you invest. But I think this is where I learned a lot. But then, of course, I could tell you from every station that I've worked at, what I've learned there at btov Venture, it was about doing sales, how to talk with LPs. At Foodlabs, I really learned how to work with portfolio companies, how to negotiate. And I've just started working here at Extantia, but there I've learned so much already now about how to look at hardware investments. And that's why I think if you as a young professional are thinking about a career in VC, it's okay also to some degree switch firms, because it just allows you to see different perspectives. And I know that some partners, they really don't like this so much, because you should always be loyal to your firm. And okay, fair enough. I think there's some merit to that. But at the same time, when you want to choose the VC profession, and you started as an analyst, because quite often you also have the case that you were a successful entrepreneur and then you found your own fund, or you joined as a partner, which is, I think, something different. But if you're really starting bottom up as an analyst, I think it's fair to look at maybe different firms. And as said, on my end, I've learned so much. I probably learned more than I would have if I had stayed just with one firm the whole time.
That's really a quite practical suggestion.
Yeah.
So why are you so invested in ClimateTech and food tech? There's so many verticals that you can choose from. So why these?
So, I mean, the first intention was just a very practical one. When I started my career, I felt like you need to have an edge. So it was just fairly opportunistic that I thought I need to specialize to some degree. And I started looking more closely into food and agriculture around 2020, which is then also later when I joined Foodlabs. And back then, the industry was also still fairly nascent. And it was driven by, on the one hand, seeing that this is a nascent industry. There are not too many specialized funds yet, so it's a good path for me personally. But then there's also the aspect to having a positive impact here, in addition to that. So, I mean, some of the talking points you will hear when you think about the timing and momentum of food and agriculture, it's just that we need to feed 10 million people by 2050, and the food system is broken. People are sick. I think in the US, every second adult or person has diabetes or is pre-diabetic. So pretty crazy statistics. And at the same time, I think COVID has shown that we need to have also a certain resilience within that system. And that's why I was drawn initially to food and ag tech. At the same time, what I've also seen, and which was also I think one of the key learnings for me over the past few years, is that everything that we do in venture capital is heavily distorted by what's happening with interest rates and what the central banks are doing. And I think we're still recovering from the hangover of the ZERP area, where it was just partially a very distorted environment, especially in the food tech sector. I've spent a ton of time looking into alternative proteins. In 2021, for example, it seemed like every company that was founded in the alternative protein space ended up raising a crazy round.
Yes.
So the hype cycle went up. Yeah. And then what comes up must come down. And now many companies that have actually developed quite healthy and have made good progress are struggling to raise a round. And you're seeing now the end of that hype cycle, and maybe that hype cycle, that famous illustration from Gartner, maybe now we're coming.
So you see lots of down rounds in these startups, or even
down rounds or companies that just didn't make it. And to some degree, and I think that's a learning that can also be now transferred to ClimateTech, is that in the end it comes down to fundamentals. There were many solutions in the food tech space that were presumably healthier and more sustainable, but that weren't cheaper or tastier. But in the end, consumers, whether it's B2B or B2C, but it's in the end, food tech is driven by a consumer's taste. If it's not tastier, if it's not cheaper, and I think you can also debate the healthiness aspect of some of these products, it just wasn't as successful. And of course, there was a time delay due to regulatory aspects, but I think this shift to fundamentals, to business fundamentals, is also something that I'm seeing now in the climate tech space. The climate space in general is incredibly broad, but one underlying theme is always we want to back, at Extantia, we want to back solutions that are just not more sustainable, but that are cheaper, incredibly more efficient, just better, and just happen to be also more sustainable.
So green is not sufficient to be backable.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so I actually read one Medium article that you wrote before. So inside alternative protein vertical, so there may be like several main areas. So the first could be like cell-based, and plant-based, and fermentation.
Yeah.
So like, can you like explain to our broad audiences like what are these each advantages of each solution or each area?
Yeah. So
and what's like what new things are going on in each of these areas?
Yeah. So the space really, I think, started developing of alternative proteins around 2013, 2014, when the first plant-based companies were founded. Yeah. Most famously Beyond Meat, which had its peak in 2021. And so these plant-based solutions were, from a technological point of view, in 2013 fairly new, but by now fairly commoditized. Yes. Because in the end you take certain plant-based proteins and enrich them, and then depending on the product, initially it was mainly minced meat, and now you have more structured meats like a steaks or whole cuts, which are a bit more challenging, but basically it works with extrusion technology, where you just sort of mix it and then just squeeze it through a tube, so you get the form. Yeah. The advantages are it's again presumably more healthy. I don't buy into that, but this is what they're claiming. They are more healthy. They are more sustainable. Sustainability you can also debate, but if you look at greenhouse gas emissions and water usage, which is the culprit when it comes to the cattle industry and the farming industry, it is better for sure. The downside is also it could foster monoculture if you have to plant lots of soy or peas. So
you mean like the material or energy used otherwise with this plant-based, might not necessarily be lower than
I think in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, there's no question that it's better. But if you look at, for example, at biodiversity, if you have just monoculture where you just grow one crop, it kills many insects and bees and smaller animals. Whereas if you look at the alternative, you just kill one cow. So this is an angle that one could take. These are the plant-based approaches. Then the next evolution are the fermentation-based approaches. You can then further distinguish between precision fermentation and biomass fermentation. And here it gets technologically already much more advanced. Precision fermentation pretty much means you can grow the exact same proteins that you would find, for example, in your milk, certain milk proteins. You can grow them using certain microbes as a host. And precision fermentation, I think, was developed in the 80s, so the technology's been around for some time in the pharma industry. I think initially as a solution for diabetes, and now it's being deployed also for food tech. And the advantages are it's much tastier because it's the real protein. The challenges are it takes longer time to go to market because you need regulatory approval, and another downside is that it's also unclear whether economically it will be as expensive as milk.
So we still haven't seen it on the supermarket.
In the US, you start seeing it now with approved strains, but in Europe not so much yet. Then there's also biomass fermentation, mainly used if you're using mycelium, which is the root of the mushrooms, and use that as a biomass that you can grow. This is probably the most compelling solution at the moment out there, because regulatory wise it's a bit easier, it tastes really good, you don't need so many ingredients, for example, as with plant-based proteins where you need many additives, and it's also fairly healthy, you have many fibers, etc. And then the third pillar beyond plant-based solutions and fermentation, exactly, it's cell-based. Cell-based is probably the most sci-fi of all of these solutions, because it means you grow the real animal cells in the lab, but it's also the most challenging one.
It's still like being developed. Technologically, it's still a challenge.
Yeah, it's still a challenge because it's really hard, to scale it. I mean, precision fermentation might also have challenges when it comes to scale, because in the end you might need fairly expensive steel tanks, and there's also debate around whether there's even enough steel in the world to really get to the scale that you need if you really want to have significant adoption. And the other aspect is just that it's just also like from a biological point of view, just really hard to grow these cells. You need certain feeds to grow these cells, and it's just going from lab to industrial scale. It's just a challenge that nobody's properly cracked yet. You can taste some of these in Singapore, for example. You can taste, or at least for quite some time, you could buy cultivated chicken meat. I think in San Francisco now as well, but it probably will take some time when we see it at scale. And there are also some other approaches now, but this is like the big picture, and I feel like I already went too much into detail.
That's quite detailed of an explanation. So that's the knowledge as an investor or researcher, but like as a meat consumer. So what's your take on these, like, what's your diet like after investing into so many like alternative protein products?
People keep making fun about this because this is also, I think, probably one of my more controversial opinions. So my former colleagues, they always made fun of me for this, about this, because I'm a food tech investor, but at the same time, my personal diet is, I try to eat less processed foods. I try to eat mainly organic, and I also try to eat like a good mixture of animal-based products and also vegetables. What I try to avoid are certain ingredients, such as seed oils. I think in the US you see an interesting discussion around this topic, somewhat controversial, but I think it's an interesting one. And I also try, in general, just avoid food that's just too heavily processed, because I think that link by now is clear. And I think however you want to feed yourself, it's the most important stuff. It's just that if you cook it yourself, it's probably good.
Less processed food. Yes, so I see this debate quite often being brought up. So like whether investors have to consume what they invest. So for example, like yourself as an investor, do you have to consume, do you have to be a big lover of like alternative protein products? I mean, some investors say no. They even don't have to play with it if it's a software.
I mean, one way to answer this, I think, is you should know the current products, definitely. I mean, as a food tech investor, I always try to taste all the products that I could taste, just so I understand the shortcomings. And the argument is, of course, many of the current solutions that you can buy and try are actually just plant-based, which is still food tech 1.0. And we talked about precision fermentation, biomass fermentation, cell cultivation. You cannot actually buy it yet. So this is why you could make the case, I'm trying this stuff, it's not good enough yet, hence we need to have more investments in that space to have actually better alternatives.
But you have tasted them even from the labs, right?
Yeah, and they are better. So for example, at Foodlabs, one of their, I think, better known portfolio companies is Formo, based here in Berlin as well, working on dairy alternatives, and their products are amazing. And there you can start buying them now in the supermarkets here, and these are also products I am actually buying myself.
So after the show, we're going to buy some
cream cheese that you can buy, which is actually almost like where you barely taste any difference.
So in terms of this area, so what kind of founder profile do you see? You're investing a lot, so you can already see it from experience.
So I've worked at different investment stages, and I think there's a difference whether you back just a founder maybe from day one onwards, when maybe there's just an idea, or whether you look at it at seed or Series A stage. But what I personally always find compelling is a founder that's obviously obsessed with the problem that exists there. And
why are they obsessed with making new food?
If they were really obsessed, it was definitely driven by just the environmental impact. And just making a change there. And then to some degree, I think you also had just people with a scientific background that also just saw a good opportunity and applying their technology maybe in the food tech space, whereas in pharma, for example, some founders previously worked more on applications in the pharma space, but there it was more challenging because pharma customers are much more conservative. So I think this is also what I've seen.
I actually read an article wrote by Northstone's partner PJ. So he said, so every like venture case happens when it's inside an industry and there's like a value chain shift. So because as a startup, you either disrupt like something inside the value chain, whose cake that you want to eat, and how do you expand that cake? inside food tech or climate tech, or like what kind of value chain shifts are you seeing right now?
Yeah, this is an excellent point. I think in the food tech industry at the moment, it's much more challenging. I think the ambitions are becoming more realistic. So we have seen the most successful companies, they really wanted to do it all initially. But I think now, instead of really rehauling the industry, I think it's much more about forming partnerships and becoming a part of that value chain. So I think in the food tech industry, just because there's a lot of headwind at the moment, and the VC market, it's just much more harder to fundraise here. And that's because the commercial traction is just not there yet, due to regulatory challenges, but also because it just takes longer than expected. Science is just, scientific problems are harder to solve than maybe others. So that's why I think in the food tech space, the approach is probably a slightly different one. And then in the climate tech space, here I think we see founders that have still more this ambition to rehaul certain industries. And this is also what we're looking for investments in Extantia, when it's really about just, for example, companies enabling the hydrogen revolution, which could fuel many industries. I think many energy topics in general. But what these companies all have in common, that have the potential and also the traction to change these industries, are just a very compelling value proposition, where they are not just greener, but as I mentioned, actually cheaper, and really help their clients then also making more money, because the solutions allow you, for example, to store more energy, or to get a higher output out of your biogas plant, for example. And I think that's a common characteristic that we see.
So as you mentioned, so like at Extantia right now, you're also focusing more on hardware tech or hard tech. And could you tell us audiences a bit about like the facts about Extantia, and like who you invest and what's your ticket size, and what kind of verticals, technologies would you back? Yeah.
Extantia was founded in 2020. Initially, we pursued a dual strategy. So that means we started making deal-by-deal investments because there wasn't a first fund yet. And at the same time, we started deploying a fund of funds. So one of our partners, Torben, was the co-founder of Signavio. They had a fairly successful exit to SAP. And then him and his fellow co-founders started a fund of fund. And that's really core to what Extantia is also doing today, is that we really want to pursue this collaborative climate platform approach also within that industry. And just recently, it's not announced yet, but we'll announce it soon. We also closed our new fund, which is 204 million euros in size. And with that, we invest in seed and Series A stage, ticket sizes from 1 to 5 million euros. Okay. And we are a climate tech generalist. So we have done lots of investments in the hardware and deep tech space. As I mentioned to you, when it comes to hydrogen or geothermal energy or
carbon capture.
Yeah, carbon capture. But we're also really seeing now a tremendous opportunity around hardware-enabled software. Just when it comes to the renewables transition in Europe, there's so much work that needs to be done, which is just operational heavy lifting. Here we've seen success stories here in Germany with Enpal or 1,5, and I think there will be many, many more of similar cases where it's about, and it's on both B2C side, it's about rolling out new solutions and just fixing some of the inefficiencies that we see within the market. So one issue, for example, is with the renewables, you have lots of fluctuation, and because of that, we need it would help if many more batteries would be deployed behind the meter. And I think that's something that we will see much more. And I think this is another more general space that we're also quite excited about.
Okay. So lately, have you seen any like exciting startups in the field that you invest? You don't have to like reveal the name of the startup, like what they do or what excites you.
Yeah. So what excites us is, as we talked about, is it's just a great co-founding team, and by that there's a certain traits, but also when you see it's a complete founding team. They are not just scientists, they are not just engineers, but they can also think commercially, thinking about distribution and have just a very clear and precise go-to-market strategy that's sometimes a bit neglected. But that's really crucial. But I guess you're looking more also and technologically. What's exciting is if a company just has a very clear USP. And that sounds so obviously you want to back a company that's much better than everything else out there. But we see quite a few companies that are maybe 20% more efficient, a bit more sustainable. And this is probably not gonna make the cut. But what I find, for example, exciting is, for example, looking into the boring space. So underground drilling. There's barely any innovation in that space. I mean, there was Elon Musk's boring company and one or two others focusing on drilling for transportation, but other than that, not so much innovation. So I think there we've recently seen one or two companies that we found really compelling with significantly cheaper solutions and thereby enabling many use cases. Another area that I found interesting is, for example, the large industrial heat pump space. So heat pumps in Germany are currently being rolled out for the consumer side, but they are also very well applicable in the B2B space. And there are, for example, certain companies that we've seen that have just targeted specific temperature ranges where no other companies can compete. So I think that's also very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I see like ClimateTech or energy is something that's heavily invested in Europe and the States. And I see like as the temperature is getting colder and colder here in Germany, I see like energy is really like a topic that's really relevant. And so what's like, what was my question? I forgot.
But Germany is not doing too well, actually. Like if you look at our energy prices, they went through the roof. So this is really, we're noticing this firsthand now. Our industry is struggling. We are an industrial country, but we think I have the second, just the UK is doing worse for whatever reasons. But I think in Germany we have the second highest energy prices. Yeah. It probably was their decision to shut off nuclear plants, and now the industry is struggling. And because of that, for sure, it would be good to have greener solutions. But we also, just from a German perspective, need to make sure that we have a basis for our industrial players, so that they can manufacture in a cheap way and are competitive. And at the moment, this is unfortunately not the case. So we're also seeing the challenges of that green transition firsthand. Yeah.
So as a VC investor, like what kind of pain points would you meet on a daily basis that you think, okay, technology should change this? Like any aspect, even it's like for daily use consumer things or energy or anything other things. Maybe you have some ideas that might inspire me. I mean, it's like a brainstorm, right? Yeah. So we're trying to find problems right now.
Yeah. I mean, for me personally, I think the point that I would like to see change in German politics is just reversing the position on...
Maybe tech cannot change this.
On nuclear policy, yeah, no. To some degree, that's always the situation. You are reliant on regulation and governmental support, yeah.
I see. So if there is one technology, despite how far-fetched it is, so what kind of technology would you back as an investor?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if I'm not constrained by fund economics, that's the important. If I wouldn't be constrained by that, I think nuclear fusion is just one of the most promising solutions out there. And I think this is really just what VC was made for, because if we're gonna get nuclear fusion to work, then all other problems will be irrelevant. And that's why it's such a groundbreaking approach that could change also many industries. But at the same time, and this is what I mentioned with the initial if, I have doubts that this can be achieved within a fund's lifetime. So in the end, as a VC, you always need to make money, and I wouldn't be too certain about what a potential exit path could look like here, unless there's like a crazy breakthrough.
Yeah. I see like lots of like VC investors investing that, and they're quite, once they're invested, like the amount is so huge already, because like not many actually founders on this planet would really have the vision to build one.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this is also the difference between European and American mindset that sometimes, I mean, just here maybe criticizing myself, that sometimes American investors tend to be more bullish and sometimes do bolder investments. Yeah.
Yeah. So, how many years have you been in Berlin as an investor? 4, 5
years, 2 years in Munich, 1 year in London, 4 years in Berlin. Yeah.
Okay. Like you've been in these 3 main tech hubs, venture hubs in Europe. So
yeah.
What's your take on Berlin?
Berlin is is very interesting, just because of its history. And still, you can really see what has happened in the city over the past 100 years. And then after the war ended, you had a wall here, you had Eastern Berlin, Western Berlin, and that led to, in Western Berlin, more crazy people living here, so to say, more artisanal people into arts, but also with a certain lifestyle. And then once the wall came down, rents were incredibly cheap. So Berlin was this sort of utopia where people came and just weren't thinking so much about the economy or something else, but were, I don't know, just moving into certain flats that were empty. That's what it was like 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And so that spirit to some degree is still within Berlin, but obviously the city has professionalized to some degree. And by now you have many large corporations here and tech companies, and the industry has really matured. But what makes what's still the city's USP is that it's relatively cheap to live in, at least compared to London or Paris, which are the city's counterparts, and that you also have that the city is attractive for people that are a bit more contrarian or want to live a certain lifestyle, that are maybe into the tech.
So maybe as a result of this, like more founders, more startups coming out of this region.
Definitely played a role, that it was attractive for scrappy startups that couldn't afford maybe more expensive cities in Germany. But some of the challenges that Berlin face are also that sometimes the city and many people outside of Berlin make fun of Berlin because sometimes it seems like it's run not very professionally. Like you might know the story of our airport. It took ages. When I look at China and Beijing, how quickly you can build an airport, and in Germany it took 15 years to build this airport in Berlin because of misadministration. So the local government isn't good. And some founders also are maybe, if they're too much into partying and techno, this can also be bad. Mm-hmm. So I think in the US sometimes they can be a bit more ambitious, or we also have that in Munich. But it's probably, I wouldn't want to generalize and go that far that people in Berlin are not as ambitious, but something that sometimes could work a bit better.
Yeah, but this is your Hauptstadt.
Yeah.
And for me, like driving more than almost 2 weeks here in Germany already, it feels me like Berlin is a large city in Germany.
It's really the only global city that we have in Germany. I'm quite fond also of Munich, but Munich feels more like a village compared to Berlin.
Yeah.
But Munich, on the other hand, they've done a tremendous job with the local ecosystem that they've built up, like the Technical University of Munich and the ecosystem around that. Incredibly well done. Berlin doesn't have something like that, and that's really also a weakness. Also, if you compare it, for example, to Paris's strong universities, which is also why it's probably the AI hub at the moment in Europe. It's Paris, and in Germany it's probably like southern Germany, Munich, Heidelberg, but it's not Berlin, unfortunately. And I think that this question of decentralization in terms of like startup hubs is a challenge for Europe and Germany as well. Because if it were all bundled, if you'd had all the startup hubs that you have in Germany, Berlin, maybe Cologne, Düsseldorf, Munich, and then you have selective universities like Aachen, Heidelberg, if it were all one hub, that you would have so many positive effects, like from this cluster, that it would be much more valuable than the current system.
But actually, to be honest, Germany is, okay, that's from a Chinese perspective, but Germany is not that large. I mean, of course, if you compare with European hubs, right, it's all within like 4 hours drive. So it's not that far. You can still, get to another place, city to exchange your ideas, especially nowadays with all these online meetings.
For sure,
Yeah, so in your view, so what's needed for Berlin or Germany to win in the tech race? in 5 years, 10 years?
To some degree, the answer to this question is also, I think, a European one, because many of the problems that Germany faces are also, I think, European ones. The most important thing that we need to change is mindset. We talked about this. Many Americans being more ambitious, being bolder, being much more salesy also. I mean, I'm not the most salesy guy myself, and this is partially sometimes also due to language barriers, but you always notice a difference when you have an American founder pitch or you have a pitch with a German founder. You probably know he's not exaggerating and the technology is solid and everything, but we tend to undersell ourselves.
Yeah.
But mindset also in terms of my upbringing, for example, Lower Saxony. It's not about working at Volkswagen, but about building the next Volkswagen. And I think the US has its own challenges in terms of it's a very polarized society. Some people are just excellent, and then you have some people that are not too strong probably. And Germany is much more about the middle. But I think we need to change the mindset. The second part we need to change is, and this is on a more European level, we need to have a common domestic market. This is probably a very large challenge and a downside compared to China or the US, that if you want to do a rollout here, you always have to think country by country, and regulation is a bit different. And regulation in general, also on a European level, is probably way too much. I mean, there was this joke, whilst OpenAI and other companies were making great progress, the EU was making regulation that the plastic bottles need to have the cap always connected to it.
Yes, I saw it because 2 years ago when I was doing Europe, it wasn't like this.
Yeah,
but just starting these 2 years.
Yeah, so we're focused on.
But why is that? Because plastic would be recycled even if they are not together.
I guess because it would be. I don't know the context. I guess the rationale would be because it would be garbage at some point and then pollute the environment. But either way, I mean, this is just a small detail, but to illustrate a larger point that we're not focused on innovation. And but I think there's been a very interesting initiative around the
ACC?
EU Inc.
Yeah, EU Inc. Yes.
Having
a unified European corporation.
Yeah, exactly. That would bring a lot of value. So I think these are probably the 3 points that would need to change. Shift in mindset, having a common domestic market, and better regulation, more standards.
Yes, I remember, when I watched the YC videos on YouTube, so several prerequisites to get funded in the States, okay?
Yeah.
You get a corporate, registered as BA, okay? Mm-hmm. Then that's the first step of being invested.
Yeah. And Delaware.
Yeah, Europe still has to get there on that step.
Yeah. Yeah, and YC is another good example of a good resource. That's probably.
But there are similar this kind of accelerators or incubations here in Europe. You have Techstars and the other stuff, or ENLA. What kind of new innovation accelerators or forces that need to be here to make it happen? I mean, you've also mentioned, it's about the whole mindset shift, but we all know that it cannot take place overnight.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And a positive observation that I've made over time is that, and this is a good thing about the very decentralized structure in Europe, is that you have many accelerators and initiatives that want to foster the transfer from technology from university to startups. There are many grants and subsidies for these kinds of programs. And if you zoom out a bit, I think in America the startup industry probably exploded in the 90s and 2000s. We also had some hype of here in Germany in the 90s, but not as substantial large as in the US. And I think China has been very successful in the 2000s and 2010s. And Europe is still catching up, but if you think Europe just started 10 or 15 years later, but is catching up, when you look at it like that, there are also then reasons to be optimistic again, especially given that we have many good universities as well and need to do a better job just transferring also then these technologies that we have to startup life then.
Yeah, so actually we didn't cover a lot about ClimateTech, but I want to dig a bit deeper into ClimateTech. So ClimateTech is something that my view could be wrong, but you can correct me. It seems like it's very nice to back, because everybody cares about climate, and we want good for climate.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's really hard to commercialize, and like who are usually the payers of these ClimateTech startups?
Yeah, you're totally right. ClimateTech has this challenge, and probably ClimateTech as a term, it could be that it will disappear in the future, because it's just, as a term, too much focused on the green part of it. But maybe ClimateTech will be broken down more into like subcategories like energy infrastructure, resilience, and other terms or verticals that do a better job of describing more the economic benefits of it.
Yeah, because climate sounds a bit like descriptive.
Yeah, exactly. And climate also is a bit idealistic. Many Europeans are very idealistic, and many founders are, which is also good. But in the end, just having the green solution, but which still comes at a green premium, won't be enough. And at Extantia, we also say we don't want to hear the term green premium anymore, but we want to hear about a green discount that a company is offering, because it just helps making the green steel much more cheaper, and thereby giving a good incentive to switching to green steel, or making white hydrogen, for example, so natural occurring hydrogen below the Earth's surface, which is a very interesting resource that we haven't fully tapped into yet. So we're looking into technologies there. But if you then could get hydrogen at a price which is much cheaper than other energy sources, then nobody will also be concerned around who's going to buy for that, because then you have just in Europe also a very large industrial basis of players that would want to switch to that. Yeah.
So would you also look for startups in Europe, like if you look at this specific like hydrogen sector, because maybe like because Europe and the States are actually like kind of a unified market, if you consider as the thesis that is backable, because like maybe you've got like 10 startups in that field.
Yeah.
Okay. So clearly, maybe you find a better startup in this field that is in the States. Would you also invest in that, or would you not only focus on Europe?
Yeah. No, we invest in Europe and in the US and Canada. Okay. And I think we have done already also quite a few investments in the US. We do have certain fund economics that we need to make work, so a larger part of our investments will be in Europe, but in principle we can invest in both continents. Of course, if there's always a certain bias or something that we need to challenge, and you know this, if like a certain US company wants backing from us, we're always wondering why do they want it from us, because there are plenty of investors in the US as well. Yeah. So it needs to make sense. So if we're in the US, probably we wouldn't be the lead. Normally we like to be the lead or co-lead, at least for European companies. But if they're US based, it probably makes sense also having a local fund to lead around. Yeah. So, otherwise there might be also a signaling issue.
Yes. Are there any like meetings or meetups, summits in Europe that you find most exciting in the space of climate tech?
Yeah, I think that I'm quite fond of the food hack and climate hack community based in Switzerland. They organize regular meetups, they have local hubs. It's a bit more skewed towards food, ag tech and climate, but it's also a great community. The Hello Tomorrow conference in Paris is quite interesting and good. And then also I think the Drop conference in Malmö, which is every year in September, organized by another ClimateTech fund, Pale Blue Dot, is a really good one. So there are a few conferences. Just last week, some of my colleagues went to the Moscow Impact Week. So there's a good community here of the climate and impact investment world.
Yeah. So like next week we're both going to Slush, and what do you expect the most from Slush?
Slush is a very fun event because I think it's probably the one meeting that attracts most of the investors and startups in Europe and partially also globally. It will be very cold, and there will be, I think, also many side events, parties, and like just fun events. So it's also not too serious, but at the same time you can really meet everyone there. So that's, I think, probably the most interesting generalist conference there. But you need to bring your
For sure.
winter coat.
Yeah, I've never been there, Helsinki. Cool.
Yeah.
So let's end up with a more personal take or personal parts of your story. So what's your biggest failure so far? And what did you learn from that?
So one failure professionally has been, I think, I was involved with one investment where I think in the end the founders overpromised on the solution that they could deliver. And there I was to some degree blinded by the ambition of the founders and what they were planning to do. In hindsight, it was almost too good to be true. And I think they were also a bit blurry about their actual progress. But as an early stage tech investor, it was, I think, back then an interesting investment to make. But I definitely learned about questioning much more also the details of certain ambitions. And also one thing that I think that you can probably generalize is if you have mixed feelings during the closing process and founders maybe not too transparent on certain issues, that you should probably challenge this. So I'm not going to go into more details here because this one is a delicate one, but it's definitely one of the investments that probably was a big mistake.
Yeah, especially given that venture capital is full of randomness. So you do want to, try to have more certainty.
Yeah. And also coming back again to that point, having not great technology is good, but not in itself sufficient. You want to back founders that think holistically about also the commercial side, about building the organization. You cannot just back great scientists or presumably great scientists. And that was a painful learning for me because I was so passionate about this company and was really fighting to make that investment. And then after 1.5 years, I myself realized, okay, I think they are.
So did it impact your later investments?
I think it just was part of the learning curve as an investor to scrutinize founders in one directions a little bit more. And that's also, I think, I don't know who said it, but one investor said that in the end, to become a good investor, you also need to have a certain amount of failures, right?
Yes,
and
sure.
We're in the outlier business here.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
So to you, what is the meaning of life?
Okay, well, this is probably a big one. So one quote that stuck with me, or maybe in general one philosopher, is Alan Watts. I'm not sure if you know him. This is like a British guy who I think died 30-40 years ago, and he was a lot involved in learning about Buddhism and Hinduism and was really like very open-minded. And he had this quote where he said, in the end, it's just all about being in the here and now and just realizing that you should just be present and realize it's a play and don't take it too seriously. So I think this is roughly the quote. Okay. I can look it up again, but I think just this mindset that when you zoom out, life to some degree is tragic and is funny, but I think you shouldn't take it too seriously and just enjoy it and see it very playful. And if you're just very engaged and very present, then I think it will turn out well. So I think I've done not the best job describing that quote, but it's been very meaningful to me, and also not taking stuff too seriously, or when I realized when I'm in a bad place that I've just maybe also too distracted by my own thoughts. So I think that whole matter of being mindful and being present is probably one answer to that question. Yeah. What do you think? What's the meaning of life for you?
Follow my passion.
Yeah.
I mean, like I posted the LinkedIn yesterday. Yeah. So for one thing, I love driving, but I'm far from being the best driver or racer. Yeah. And I was once in VC, and I love to build authentic connection with founders, VCs. Yeah. But I really never ever, like started something or ventured. But now I'm doing this, like doing these two things all together. Yeah. And also exploring a more sustainable way to commercialize it, and also to make it get rolled.
Yeah, totally. No, I really like that a lot, and I think you probably get a lot of meaning out doing your own thing.
Yes, lots of.
Whereas just being a bit more passive.
Yeah, of course. From every podcast, from every guest, I learn something.
Yeah,
that's for sure. and we're doing it to really, it's truly global podcast. It's because like lots of so-called global podcasts, they don't include Chinese, but Chinese, like they're like 1.4 billion people there.
100%.
And you directly neglect that. Of course, like it's really not in the mainstream like narrative of the global like tech scene or anything like that. But we try to cover all these major markets, and in the future we're also gonna dive into a bit more neglected areas. For example, like Latin America, more emerging markets, or even Africa. We'd love to see that happen. And we're also gonna include all our VC podcasts within a map, which you've got like different dimensions. Of course, that's like cool. what you cover, who you invest, who are you, and what's your USP as a fund, and also with our video podcast, because video really adds another dimension of information into that. And then both for founders and even global investors, that would be a great source of information.
No, this is fantastic, and I think so valuable, because we sometimes take it for granted that we live to some degree in a globalized world. But I mean, we've seen it recently. I mean, there have been tensions globally arising, and I think in light of that, having more, as you mentioned, authentic interactions and being connected sounds trivial, but it's and it's not happening, as you said. I think everybody is in their own bubble and reading their own news, reading whatever confirms their own biases and the view of the world. So I think in light of that, it's just so important to...
I mean, like geopolitical tensions are there and they're happening, but we try to, you know, ignore those barriers. And we are just talking about venture capital. Why are you venture capital? And what's your wildest tech dreams? It's not about politics. It's not about... Of course, like politics can be like a hurdle in realizing these techs. But we're purely talking about venture capital and how this line of business, the venture capital as an industry, could evolve.
And having this optimistic view of the world, asking around the wildest questions is, I think, also so crucial for humanity to have that optimism. And
if you still believe that venture capital could accelerate the technology. Cool. And the podcast went in a very good flow. I really appreciate it, Christian.
Thank you so much for coming by. It was a pleasure to chat.
Really nice. And hopefully we're going to see like more of your portfolio companies while you're investing here in Extantia.
Hopefully,
Yeah, of course, very soon.
Yes.
Cool.
Well,
Christian.
Thank you so much.